And back to our top story, with Vladimir Putin having just addressed senior military and security officials in front of the Kremlin. Joining me now from Kiev is Peter Zalmayev, the director of the Eurasian Democracy Initiative. Peter, we lost you there to begin with, so I'm going to repeat the question again. Given what we've witnessed over the weekend, is this the case that Vladimir Putin's days are indeed numbered?
It's a guessing game. We can certainly say that his power has suffered a severe blow. I mean, he can hang on in all sorts of configurations as a weakened figure. Remember, Leonid Brezhnev of the Soviet Union was a kind of a consensus figure after Khrushchev, and was, satisfactory to all parties involved because he was considered kind of a pushover, a weakling, and therefore of no threat to anyone. Vladimir Putin may have that role to play in a very much diminished state now that he showed that essentially, contrary to what he said at this awarding of the soldiers, there was no loyalty demonstrated to him at all. When Prigozhin's army was allowed to march unimpeded through Russian towns and almost reach the outskirts of Moscow within less than a day, with people on the streets of the cities chanting Wagner, Wagner. No one was chanting Putin, and that's, I think, speaks volumes about what Russians really think about Vladimir Putin.
And this is the thing, in terms of the censorship of Russian media, it's very hard for us outside of the country to get a sense of what Russian people are thinking or saying. But as you say, the absence of anybody rushing forward to throw their support behind Vladimir Putin says a million things, doesn't it?
It does, and this is not to say that there are necessarily any viable alternatives to Vladimir Putin, or that Prigozhin himself commanded some superhuman loyalty of the Russians. It's just that Vladimir Putin, in his 24 years of power, deprived little by little his citizens, of their agency as such, as citizens, as voters, with elections routinely stolen, with massive falsifications, with grand corruption on an unimaginable scale, appointing heads of regional administrations to the point where Russians probably would live with Prigozhin or anyone else, or the devil with horns. It doesn't matter. They do not feel as full participants in the political project by the name of Russia. And so this is what we have at the 24 year of Vladimir Putin reign. There's no loyalty that he can necessarily speak of, and it's been amply demonstrated. Anyone who will rise up, Russians will welcome. Among other things, I think there's a psychological also element involved. I mean, after 24 years, as deprived of political agency as the Russians are, they still probably want to see some changes and fresh faces. And that's what we saw as Prigozhin was marching through these Russian towns.
And with you based in Kiev, I want to ask you, what is the significance of all this for Ukrainian fighters?
Well, the significance of this is obviously, if it had lasted a little longer, it would have been better. Rostov, which Prigozhin went on to occupy within hours of his announcement, is a logistical, as a military hub for the Russian army. It would have definitely hampered Russia's military efforts. But be that as it may, I think it's still, once again, I think it's a huge blow to Vladimir Putin's prestige. But more to the point, Prigozhin, as part of his as the rationale for the actions that he took, announced that he was going to Moscow to get rid of the corrupt military officials who had launched this war on false premises, were not winning it, and that obviously cannot boost the morale of the Russian soldiers, who have just been told that this war has been a lie. There was no discrimination against Russian speakers in the Donbass, contrary to what the Russian propaganda is saying. The Ukrainians had not been bombing the Donbass all these 8 years. So I just can't imagine how this would be a boost to Russia's continuing its illegal war in Ukraine.
I just want to take a pause there, Peter, because at this point I want to listen to what Prigozhin, the embattled Wagner boss, said in the last few hours. Let's just take a listen to what the chief of Wagner had to say.
The civilians were glad to see us. We showed a masterclass on how the 24th of February 2022 should have looked like. We did not have the goal of overthrowing the existing regime and the legally elected government, which was said many times. We turned around in order not to shed the blood of Russian soldiers.
And joining me is Peter Zalmayev, the director of the Eurasian Democracy Initiative. In regards there to Prigozhin, I would say that his lifespan is perhaps somewhat been shortened given the events of the last few days. I mean, at this stage, we have no idea as to his whereabouts. What do you think is going to happen to the chief of Wagner?
Well, Russian leaders throughout the centuries of Russian history have shown absolutely zero tolerance for this sort of traitors that Prigozhin is. Going back to the times of Peter the Great and the Mazepa, the Ukrainian warlord who cast his lot with the Swedes, and those who supported him on the Ukrainian side, the Cossacks, paid a dear price afterwards. And this throughout Russian history. That is the case. But that is sort of the vice in which Vladimir Putin finds himself. I mean, having so dramatically and publicly promised Prigozhin and his coterie this immunity after essentially calling him a traitor, to turn around and be seen as being behind his eventual assassination would probably undercut his authority further. But I don't think at this point he even cares about that as much. There are myriads of ways to get rid of Prigozhin without, with a plausible sort of deniability. But I think what's even more important here, once again, is that who may be behind Prigozhin and what really happened. Is there potentially a faction within the Kremlin that wanted to send Putin a signal, maybe to stand down, stop the criminal war in Ukraine? It's hurting everyone. There's no clear victory in sight. Notice the very important thing, Prigozhin was allowed to do what he did without even probably having in mind conquering Moscow. He had his, he had his grievances. He wanted his piece of the pie. He got it. He got out, but only after Vladimir Putin went on Russian TV and humiliated himself, weakening himself. Only then was Prigozhin told to stand out if there was someone telling him that. I don't believe Lukashenko has much of a material, role to play. He was just a go-between. But the question remains, who in the Kremlin may have inspired Prigozhin's actions and who may be still protecting him?
Do you have any idea as to who indeed could be behind Prigozhin?
You know what? I will say anyone, even hardliners like Mr. Patrushev, all the security chiefs around Putin. No one in the elite has benefited much from this war. They are persona non grata in the West that they love so much, contrary to what they say. The West, where they've been sending their children to schools, where they've been buying properties. It's become clear to all of them that this is a morass. Russia's not going to win this war. They need to get out as soon as possible. So there are probably a whole lot of candidates who could be behind.
With that in mind, how prepared is Ukraine and its allies for a post-Putin Russia, and what would it look like?
Well, that's a question that Ukrainian officials are raising. Once again, this coup showed that the West is probably, contrary to what you hear from Western capitals, Washington, that they knew this was coming. They're still not prepared, just like they were not prepared for what happened in 1991 and the Soviet Union fell. This is a good time to put your heads together, start thinking about what happens to the nuclear arsenal, what happens to the succession. But I can tell you the mood in Ukraine is that whatever is happening in Russia that continues to undermine Putin's grip on power is good in the long run, because it does undermine Vladimir Putin's war machinery. It's just a matter for the West to make sure that there's, once again, security of Russia's nuclear forces and, a clear vision of who will be that person who comes to power in Moscow and what kind of arrangement to make with him. It's including with the big question of rebuilding Ukraine. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars that Russia is responsible for.
Peter Zalmayev, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.